Gerardo's voice boomed through the vast, immaculate space of his auto shop. It was a sound that mingled with the metallic echo of tools and the deafening roar of engines, the soundtrack, he believed, to his empire. "I'll give you my entire business if you can fix this," he proclaimed with a cruel laugh, his dark eyes fixed on the small, nervous figure of Valeria, the young woman who, hoping for a new beginning, dared to step into his sacred territory. Gerardo's voice, heavy with the disdain inherent to his personality, filled every corner, as if the very air recoiled from his arrogance. He was the kind of man who built his success on the humiliation of others. And at that moment, Valeria became the perfect target for his ruthless entertainment. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, with the anticipation of the mechanics, who had all stopped their work to witness what Gerardo considered a personal comedy, a spectacle of submission that reinforced his absolute dominion in this temple of speed and power. Valeria, her hands trembling, but an indomitable spark in her eyes, took the keys Gerardo held out to her with contempt, as if they were a contaminated object. The engine, a Porsche 911 that had sat inert for a week in the center of the shop, stood like a metal colossus, a challenge that had humbled Gerardo's most seasoned mechanics. What Valeria coaxed from that engine, however, was not a whisper of disappointment, but a thunderous roar that froze the mocking smile on Gerardo's face, twisting his amusement into a mask of astonishment, and for the first time in a long time, genuine fear. Surprise seized them all. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the deafening sound of the engine, which had been mute for days. It became the voice of victory, a resonant anthem that announced a change, the shattering of a paradigm once thought unshakable in this place of machines and men. Gerardo Santander, a man of 45, had woven his fortune and reputation from the foundations of his auto shop, the most prestigious in the country, a sanctuary where only Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches, vehicles worth more than entire mansions, were welcome. His office, a glass fortress with panoramic views of his mechanics, was a monument to his opulence and his boundless ego. Floors of fine Italian ceramic, state-of-the-art tools worth fortunes, and a reputation that screamed his superiority were all just ornaments for his true pleasure, humiliation. But what delighted Gerardo most was not wealth or power itself, but the ability they gave him to crush those he considered inferior, especially women who dared to challenge his notion of what he called the sacred territory of men. This deep-seated misogyny was the fuel for his ego, the driving force behind every decision, every word, every glance he cast upon those who did not fit his narrow worldview. The nervous voice of his receptionist, Inez, crackled through the intercom, interrupting his pleasant contemplation of his empire. "Mr. Santander," she said, her voice a thin thread, "there's a young woman here. She says she's here for the mechanic position." A young woman? A cruel laugh escaped his lips, a sound Inez knew meant trouble. "Send her in," he commanded, his tone dripping with sadistic anticipation. "This is going to be fun," he muttered to himself, already imagining the spectacle of humiliation about to unfold. To him, Valeria's arrival was not a chance to find talent, but a new act in his personal theater of cruelty, an opportunity to reaffirm his dominance and the validity of his prejudice. At 28, Valeria Morales had spent her entire life in small garages, dreaming of the chance to prove her skills in a place as prestigious as this. She entered Gerardo's office nervously, clutching a carefully prepared resume that represented weeks of effort and hope. Her work clothes, though worn, were impeccable, speaking to her meticulous nature and respect for the profession. She had arrived 2 hours early to ensure she was on time and had rehearsed her introduction in front of the mirror until she had memorized every word, every gesture. "Good afternoon, Mr. Santander," Valeria said, her voice steady despite her nerves, exuding a profound respect. She extended her resume like an offering. "I'm Valeria Morales. I'm here about the mechanic vacancy you posted." Inside, a storm of hope and fear churned. Aware of the challenge she faced by breaking into a world so deeply rooted in tradition and prejudice. Gerardo, however, made no move to take the paper. Instead, his eyes raked over her, a predator's smile that never reached his eyes. "You?" he finally asked, his voice laced with a contempt that poisoned the air. "You want to work as a mechanic? Here?" The question was not an inquiry, but a declaration of disbelief, an attempt to strip Valeria of her dignity before she could even defend herself. "Yes, sir. I have 5 years of experience and—" Valeria began, but Gerardo cut her off with a laugh that echoed through the office. 5 years changing oil in neighborhood garages. That's what you call experience. The humiliation was palpable, a direct assault on her professional worth. Heat rose in Valeria's cheeks, but with surprising inner strength, she maintained her composure, her gaze fixed on Gerardo, her determination unshaken. "Sir, if you would just look at my resume, you'll see that—" "I don't need to see anything," Gerardo snapped, rising to his feet and circling her like a shark. "Do you know how much the cheapest car that comes into this shop costs? $200,000. Do you know what your experience is worth? Nothing." Gerardo's words were a cold slap, an attempt to reduce her to insignificance. But deep down, Valeria knew her value wasn't measured by the price of the cars she repaired, but by the passion, knowledge, and dedication she poured into every task. Her experience, though not validated by Gerardo's superficial standards, was a treasure trove of learning, of trial and error, of countless hours spent understanding the intricate secrets of engines. Just then, laughter erupted from the main floor. Three of his mechanics, Patrizio, Emiliano, and Rodrigo, the most experienced and arrogant of the crew, had finished their break. Drawn by the spectacle, they watched through the glass, then approached the office, their faces twisted in mockery. "What do we have here, boss?" Patricio asked with a sneer. "A new secretary?" "Even better," Gerardo applauded sarcastically. "This young lady wants to be a mechanic." The three men roared with laughter. Emiliano wiped tears from his eyes. "Seriously? A woman wants to get her hands dirty with real engines?" "You sure you didn't mistake this place for a beauty salon?" Rodrigo jeered. Valeria clenched her fists, the fire of humiliation burning inside her. These comments, so common in her career, hurt more deeply now, perhaps because of the unified wall of prejudice rising before her. "Gentlemen," Gerardo addressed his employees, a diabolical smile playing on his lips. "I believe we should be polite to our visitor. After all, she has 5 years of experience." The mechanics exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the tone their boss used when he was planning a particularly cruel public humiliation. Valeria. He said her name as if it were a joke, a camouflaged insult. Why don't you show us this experience of yours? We have a Porsche 911 out there with an engine problem. It's been here a week, and our simple mechanics haven't been able to find the fault. Sir, I would be happy to. Wait. Gerardo held up a hand theatrically, savoring the moment. I'm not finished. If you can actually diagnose and repair that engine, I'll give you the job, but not just any job. He paused dramatically, scanning his employees to ensure they were all witnesses to his grand cruelty. I'll give you my job. I'll make you a partner. The silence that followed was deafening. The three mechanics stood with their mouths agape at the magnitude of the bet. But Gerardo continued with a sadistic grin. When you fail miserably, as I'm certain you will, you don't just leave. You will sign a document promising to abandon forever any pretense of being a mechanic. The cruelty of the proposal was brutal, an attempt to destroy not only her career, but her spirit. Patricio stepped closer to Gerardo, his voice a cautious whisper. Boss, are you sure? That Porsche is extremely complex. If by some chance she... There are no chances, Gerardo roared, cutting him off. A woman who has worked in neighborhood garages will never solve what you, with years of experience in luxury cars, could not. Valeria looked at the four men surrounding her, their contempt a physical force. For 28 years, she had endured comments about how mechanics was no place for a woman, how her hands were too delicate, how she should find a more appropriate job. Each word was a dagger, each glance a constant reminder of the invisible, relentless barriers before her. And what do I gain if I accept and fail? Valeria asked, her unwavering calm surprising everyone. Gain? Gerardo scoffed. You gain nothing. You lose everything. But if you insist on humiliating yourself publicly, go ahead. It will be entertaining. In that moment, something inside Valeria snapped. It wasn't just the injustice of the situation, but the accumulated weight of years of disrespect, of closed doors, of opportunities denied simply because she was a woman. She had seen mediocre men get jobs she deserved. She had heard countless times that customers preferred a man to check their cars. I accept, she said, her voice so firm it silenced the room. Gerardo blinked, caught completely off guard. Seriously? You're completely serious? Valeria met his gaze, a defiant spark in her eyes. But I want the agreement in writing, and I want every mechanic in this shop present while I work on the engine. Gerardo's smile returned, wider and more malevolent than before. Perfect. This is going to be even more fun than I thought. We'll make a whole show of it. As Gerardo summoned every employee to witness what he believed would be the most epic humiliation of his career, Valeria walked silently toward the black Porsche, waiting in the center of the shop. She didn't know that in the next 30 minutes, her life would change forever. And Gerardo Santander's arrogance was about to receive the most devastating lesson of its existence. The stage was set. Gerardo's workshop had transformed into a modern Roman circus. Word of the ridiculous bet had spread like wildfire, and the promise of a spectacle was too great to ignore. In less than 10 minutes, 20 people had gathered around the black Porsche 911, forming a circle like bloodthirsty spectators waiting for the gladiators to fight, morbid curiosity shining in their eyes. Gerardo had chairs brought from the administrative office, officially turning the humiliation into a public event. He positioned himself at the center, arms crossed, a sadistic smirk on his face, like a conductor awaiting the start of his most wicked symphony. Beside him, Patrizio, Emiliano, and Rodrigo whispered among themselves, placing bets on how long it would take Valeria to admit defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, Gerardo exclaimed, with a theatrical flourish, as if he were the ringmaster of a macabre show. Welcome to the event of the year. In this corner, we have Valeria Morales, who claims to have 5 years of experience changing oil in neighborhood garages. Laughter echoed through the workshop, a cacophony of mockery trying to drown out the voice in Valeria's head. A few employees pulled out their phones, clearly planning to record what they assumed would be a viral moment, a testament to someone else's humiliation for their own entertainment. And in the other corner, Gerardo gently tapped the Porsche's tire with his foot, a dismissive gesture. We have a precision German engine that has defeated my three best mechanics for a full week. An engine worth more than everything our contender has earned in her entire life. Valeria approached the vehicle slowly, completely ignoring the circus that had formed around her, her focus unbreakable. Her eyes were fixed on the Porsche, studying every visible detail, the way it was positioned, the marks on the floor indicating its exact placement over the past week, the scattered tools that betrayed the previous repair attempts. Need someone to show you how to open the hood? Emiliano sneered, provoking another round of laughter. Or do you even know how to use the basic tools? Valeria didn't answer. Her silence was a statement of intent. Instead, she walked a slow circle around the car. Her hands hadn't touched a thing, yet her eyes were absorbing information like a laser scanner. She could see the fingerprints on certain parts of the engine bay, the tool marks on specific bolts, the wires that had been disconnected and reconnected multiple times. Look at that, Rodrigo pointed with disdain. She doesn't even know where to start. She's just circling it like a lost dog. Maybe she's waiting for a man to show up and tell her what to do, a young mechanic from the crowd added, drawing more cruel laughter. The air was thick with misogyny and contempt. Gerardo savored every second of it, his face lit with sadistic satisfaction. In the 20 years he had spent building his automotive empire, he'd never had such a perfect opportunity to publicly demonstrate why women didn't belong in his world. This humiliation would be legendary, something spoken of in every workshop in the city for years to come. A story told and retold to reaffirm male superiority in the world of mechanics. Valeria, Gerardo shouted over the din, his voice commanding the crowd's attention. You have 1 hour. After that, you sign the paper and you get out of here for good. The threat was explicit. The clock was ticking, and Valeria's fate hung by a thread, subject to the cruel will of Gerardo and the complexity of that engine. Finally, Valeria spoke, but her voice was so low that only those closest could hear it, a murmur that cut through the mockery and disdain. I need to see the history of the repairs you attempted. The history? Patricio scoffed. What for? To copy us? No, Valeria replied, not with malice, but with a firmness that startled several of them, a confidence that disarmed their ridicule. To avoid repeating the mistakes you obviously made. The comment struck like a slap. Patricio's face flushed with anger. Mistakes? Us? We're certified professionals. We've worked on cars you can't even pronounce. Then it will be easy for you to explain exactly what you tried. Valeria looked him directly in the eye. Without intimidation, only a genuine, professional curiosity that dismantled any attempt to dismiss her. The crowd had grown quieter. Something in Valeria's calm, direct manner had shifted the energy in the room. She no longer seemed like a nervous victim, waiting to be devoured. She sounded like a professional, asking legitimate technical questions. Emiliano stepped in aggressively, feeling attacked by her composure. We checked the entire injection system, changed the spark plugs, verified the fuel pressure. We ran diagnostics on the electrical system with state-of-the-art computers. And the results? Valeria asked, finally beginning to open the Porsche's hood, her movements deliberate and precise. Does the engine start? It starts, Rodrigo answered, his frustration obvious. But it loses power. After 5 minutes, it chokes, vibrates like crazy, and then shuts down completely. Valeria processed the information as if it were a key piece of the puzzle that everyone else had missed. When the hood was fully open, it revealed the mechanical heart of the vehicle. A six-cylinder engine that was a work of German engineering art, now lying silent and rebellious. A sleeping giant waiting for the right hands to awaken it. "My God!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Look at the way she's staring at it, like it's the first time she's ever seen an engine." The mockery floated back into the air, but something was different. While some jeered, a few of the more experienced mechanics, those with a true passion for their craft, had begun to watch her more carefully. That wasn't the lost gaze of a novice. It was the systematic evaluation of someone who understood what they were seeing. Every detail, every anomaly, every hint of a problem. Valeria leaned over the engine, and for the first time since she had entered the workshop, she smiled. It was a smile of recognition, as if she had just seen an old friend. "What are you smiling at?" Gerardo asked suspiciously. Something about that smile made him uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. The confidence on Valeria's face, her silent connection with the machine, was destabilizing the narrative he had so carefully constructed. "Nothing important," Valeria replied, beginning to roll up the sleeves of her work shirt with a calm that infuriated Gerardo. "This engine just reminds me of something." Her tone, devoid of emotion, was a silent challenge. "Reminds you of what? The lawnmower engines you're used to working on?" Patricio sneered, trying to regain the momentum of the humiliation that was beginning to fade. Valeria didn't answer immediately. Instead, her fingers began to trace parts of the engine, not randomly, but in a specific pattern that no one present recognized. Her movements were precise, deliberate, a choreography of knowledge that stood in stark contrast to their impatience. "Interesting," Valeria murmured, more to herself than to the audience. "Very interesting." "What's interesting?" Gerardo demanded, his patience wearing thin. This wasn't the show he had anticipated. Valeria was supposed to be in tears by now, not acting as if she owned the place. "The wear pattern on these parts," Valeria said, pointing to a specific section of the engine, her finger tracing an invisible line over the machinery, "is not consistent with the type of failure you described." An uncomfortable silence fell over the workshop. The mechanics exchanged confused glances. The technical terms she used were correct, precise, the language they themselves used, but from her, it carried an unexpected authority. Don Evaristo, the shop's most senior mechanic at 65, moved closer, his genuine interest now overriding any initial amusement. "What kind of pattern do you see?" he asked, his voice free of the mockery the others had used. It was a tone of respect that resonated in the quiet room. Valeria met his gaze, instantly recognizing the voice of real experience. "The wear suggests the problem isn't in the injection system, as you thought. It's in the timing. Impossible, Emiliano protested, his voice laced with disbelief. We checked the timing 3 times. With what method? Valeria asked quietly. With with the standard method, Emiliano stammered, suddenly less sure of himself. The standard German method for this specific Porsche 911 generation, Valeria pressed gently, her question landing like a bomb. Or the generic standard method you use for all cars? Gerardo realized that Valeria didn't just know terminology. She knew brand and model specific technical specifications. That was knowledge that only came from years of specialized experience or serious technical education. How do you know about specific Porsche methods? Don Evaristo asked, now completely fascinated. Valeria paused, as if deciding how much of her past she was willing to expose to their prying eyes. I've worked with German engines before. Where? Gerardo demanded, his voice losing its tone of amusement and taking on one of genuine concern. A flicker of fear was beginning to seep into his arrogance. In places where precision matters more than appearances, Valeria replied, her hands now disconnecting wires with movements that were far too confident for someone who had supposedly only worked in neighborhood garages. The crowd was completely silent. The spectacle that had begun as a public shaming was transforming into something else entirely. And Gerardo, for the first time all afternoon, began to feel that he might have gravely underestimated the woman now working with absolute confidence on the most expensive engine in his shop. The following 20 minutes were the most tense in the history of Gerardo Santander's workshop. What had started as a show of public humiliation had morphed into a reverential silence, as everyone watched Valeria work with a precision that defied all logic. Her hands moved over the engine as if it were an instrument she had played 1,000 times before, a dance of knowledge and skill that mesmerized them all. There was no hesitation, no guesswork. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, professional. What exactly is she doing? Emiliano whispered to Patricio, his voice thick with an anxiety he could no longer hide. I have no idea, Patricio whispered back, his eyes fixed on Valeria's hands. I've never seen that disconnection sequence before. Gerardo had moved closer to the car, abandoning his arrogant perch. For 20 years, he had seen hundreds of mechanics work. He instantly recognized the patterns of professionals versus amateurs, and what he was seeing now didn't fit into any category he knew. Valeria, Gerardo interrupted, trying to keep his voice calm despite the growing unease. Where did you say you worked before? Valeria didn't look up from the engine. I didn't, she replied simply, her concentration absolute. Well, I'm asking you now, Gerardo insisted, his patience cracking, because that technique you're using, you don't learn that just anywhere. For the first time since she began, Valeria paused. She lifted her gaze to Gerardo, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the nervous look of a desperate employee. It was the calm, evaluative gaze of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and was deciding just how much truth she was willing to share. I've worked in many places, she finally replied, returning her attention to the engine. Some more specialized than others. How specialized? Don Evaristo asked, his decades of experience telling him he was witnessing something extraordinary. Valeria smiled slightly, a smile that held years of untold stories, specialized enough to recognize that this engine doesn't have the problem you diagnosed. Impossible, Rodrigo protested, though his voice was weaker now, his skepticism crumbling. We've worked on this car for a week. We know exactly what the problem is. Really? Valeria asked, her tone one of pure curiosity. Then explain to me why you applied the standard diagnostic protocol to an engine that has clearly been modified. The silence that followed was deafening. The three mechanics exchanged glances, their confusion mounting, their faces mirroring the magnitude of their mistake. Modified? Gerardo asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in his gut. What do you mean, modified? Valeria pointed to a specific section of the engine, her movements precise and instructive, as if giving a master class to bewildered students. This engine has internal modifications that aren't visible from a superficial inspection. The injection system has been recalibrated to work with specifications far exceeding factory standards. Valeria explained with astonishing clarity, unraveling the engine's mystery. That's impossible, Patricio stammered, his voice barely a whisper. We would have noticed such significant modifications. Would you have? Valeria asked softly, her voice like a feather brushing against Patricio's arrogance. Did you check the ECU's programming code? Did you verify the pressure specifications against the modified standards instead of the factory ones? Did you consider that the symptoms you described are exactly what happens when you apply standard protocols to a system that has been optimized for competition-level performance? The question was a dagger to the mechanic's professional ego, a direct assault on their supposed expertise. The technical terms Valeria was using were of a specialization none of them fully grasped, a jargon that transcended their limited knowledge. How do you know? Don Evaristo asked, his voice now laced with genuine respect and a palpable fascination, admiration shining in his eyes. About competition-grade ECU modifications? Valeria paused again, longer this time, weighing her words. She could feel the eyes of 20 people fixed on her, waiting for an answer she knew would completely change the dynamic of the situation, a revelation that would alter the course of events. Because I've worked on competition cars before, she finally admitted, her voice a murmur that cut through the expectant silence. What kind of competition? Gerardo demanded, his voice now tense with an anxiety he couldn't hide, the fear of the unknown creeping in. The kind where mistakes cost you races, Valeria replied, turning back to the engine with renewed focus, her hands moving with an astounding familiarity. And where precision isn't optional. The crowd had begun to murmur. The implications of what Valeria was suggesting were enormous. Competition cars represented the highest echelon of automotive mechanics, a world accessible only to the most elite technicians, a level to which few could ever aspire. In what category of competition? Don Evaristo pressed, clearly captivated by the possibilities unfolding before him. Several, Valeria answered vaguely. But then, as if making a momentous decision, she added, mainly Formula and GT. The effect of those two words was like a bomb detonating in silence, the truth of it echoing through the workshop. Formula and GT were the most prestigious and technically demanding categories in global motorsport. The mechanics who worked at those levels were the absolute elite of the profession, the surgeons of speed. Gerardo felt the floor shift beneath his feet. His world of certainties was crumbling. For his entire career, he had prided himself on being the best in his field, but he had never worked anywhere near the level of competition Valeria had just mentioned. A chasm of experience and knowledge opened up before him. Are you saying you've worked in Formula One? Patricio asked in utter disbelief. his voice a whisper of awe. I didn't say Formula One, Valeria corrected calmly, her voice steady and controlled. I said formula. There are several formula categories. Which ones? Emiliano insisted. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by genuine curiosity and a hint of fear. Valeria finally looked up from the engine and met the eyes of the crowd surrounding her. For the first time since she had walked into the workshop, there was no submission in her posture. There was the quiet confidence of someone who knew her exact professional worth, a conviction that radiated from her. Formula 3, Formula 2, and yes, she paused deliberately, savoring the impact of her words. Formula 1 as well. The silence that followed was so profound, you could hear the ticking of the wall clock in Gerardo's office, a sound that amplified the tension in the room. Formula 1 was the Mount Everest of automotive mechanics. It was where the best engineers and technicians in the world worked, where budgets were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, and where every millisecond of an advantage could determine world championships, a universe of precision and speed that few ever reached. That's impossible. Gerardo finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled, a thread of sound barely escaping his throat. If you'd really worked in Formula One, you wouldn't be here, looking for a job in my garage. It was a logical observation, and Valeria had been expecting it. She knew the question would come, and she had to decide how much of the truth she was willing to reveal, how much of her past she would share with those who had judged her so harshly. You're right, Valeria admitted, her voice a whisper tinged with a barely perceptible sadness. If I were still working in Formula One, I wouldn't be here. What happened? Don Evaristo asked gently, his tone free of judgment, filled only with genuine professional curiosity and empathy that cut through the cold atmosphere. Valeria returned to the engine, but this time her movements had a different quality, a subtle sorrow in the way she touched the components, as if each part reminded her of something painful, a past that haunted her. Politics, she answered simply, her voice a quiet lament. In the highest levels of motorsport, sometimes talent isn't enough if you don't have the right connections, or if you don't fit certain people's expectations of who should be in those positions. The implications of that statement hit everyone like a hammer. The automotive industry, especially at its most elite levels, was notoriously male-dominated. The few women who managed to break through those barriers faced additional obstacles their male counterparts never had to consider. A brutal reality Valeria knew firsthand. Did they push you out for being a woman? A voice from the crowd asked, laced with indignation, the echo of an injustice resonating in the workshop. Not directly, Valeria replied, continuing her work, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. Let's just say that when budgets get tight and staff cuts have to be made, the reasons for keeping or letting someone go can become very creative. Gerardo realized he had made a monumental mistake. He had not only underestimated Valeria, he had publicly humiliated someone whose professional credentials surpassed anyone in his shop, including his own. Where did you work? Gerardo asked, his voice now stripped of arrogance, tinged with shame and desperation. McLaren Junior Development Program, then Williams as an associate technician, and finally, Red Bull Racing for 2 seasons, Valeria listed without drama, as if reciting her resume in a normal interview, the names of elite teams rolling off her tongue with astonishing naturalness. The names landed like bombshells, reverberating through the workshop. These weren't minor or unknown teams. They were some of the most prestigious and successful teams in the history of Formula One. The fact that Valeria had worked for them placed her in a global elite category that no one in that workshop had ever imagined reaching. "And now you're looking for work here?" Rodrigo asked, his voice a mixture of awe and shame for how they had treated her. "Now, I'm trying to rebuild my career from scratch," Valeria answered with brutal honesty, her voice a silent lament of injustice. "Because when you leave that world, no one else wants to hire you. Mid-level teams think you're too expensive or too specialized. Local teams think you're arrogant or can't adapt to smaller budgets. And garage owners like me think you're a fraud," Gerardo added in a low voice, the realization of his error crashing down on him like an avalanche, shame flooding his senses. "Exactly," Valeria confirmed without bitterness, only with the resignation of someone who had lived that reality for months, a truth that had deeply scarred her. In that moment, something fundamentally shifted in the workshop's atmosphere. What had begun as a cruel spectacle had transformed into something else entirely, a lesson in humility that no one present would ever forget. Valeria, who had started the day as a supplicant, desperate for a job, now worked on the engine with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was about to demonstrate exactly why she had reached the highest levels of her profession. The Porsche was about to roar in a way none of them had ever heard before, a sound that would announce a change, the victory of perseverance over prejudice. And Gerardo Santander's humiliation was just beginning. The silence in the workshop had acquired an almost religious quality, a reverence imposed by Valeria's mastery. 20 people stood motionless, watching her every move with a mixture of fascination and reverential terror, their eyes fixed on her hands. The revelation of her Formula One experience had completely transformed the dynamic of the place. She was no longer a desperate woman begging for a job. She was a living legend, working on an engine that had defeated the best local mechanics, an extraordinary being in an ordinary world. Gerardo stood paralyzed 10 feet from the Porsche, feeling his world of certainty crumble piece by piece. For 20 years, he had built his professional identity on the belief that he ran the most prestigious workshop in the city, with the best mechanics available. Now, he realized he had been operating in the minor leagues while humiliating someone who had worked in the NFL of automotive mechanics. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the implications. McLaren, Williams, Red Bull Racing, those names echoed in his head like funeral bells tolling for his arrogance. He had watched those teams on television for years, had secretly dreamed of one day having even a remote connection to that glamorous, technically supreme world. And now he discovered that the woman he had publicly humiliated had been an integral part of that global elite. "How long did you work at Red Bull?" Don Evaristo asked, his voice no longer attempting to hide his absolute admiration, respect radiating from him. Valeria continued working as she answered, her hands moving with the precision of a cardiovascular surgeon. 2 full seasons, 2019 and 2020. I worked directly with Max Verstappen's team during his rise to the championship. The name Verstappen landed like a thunderbolt. Even people who knew little about Formula One recognized that name. He was one of the most successful and renowned drivers in the world, a world champion whose car had been maintained, in part, by the hands of the woman now hunched over a Porsche in a city garage. My God, someone whispered from the crowd. You worked with Verstappen. On his car, Valeria corrected modestly. I was part of the technical team that ensured the engine performed perfectly every race Sunday. When your job directly affects the chances of winning a world championship, you learn not to make mistakes. Patrizio, Emiliano, and Rodrigo were completely speechless. The magnitude of their error in underestimating Valeria was so immense that their brains struggled to process it. Shame washed over them. They had spent the last week boasting to each other about their technical skills, their experience with expensive cars, their professional superiority. But compared to keeping a Formula One car running at 300 kilometers per hour in front of millions of global spectators, their experience seemed as relevant as that of first-year apprentices. Why didn't you say so from the beginning? Gerardo asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of shame and desperation, regret palpable in every syllable. Valeria looked up from the engine for a moment, and for the first time, Gerardo saw a deep sadness in her eyes, a pain that went beyond the humiliation of the moment. What for? So you could think I was lying? So you could tell me that someone with my experience would never be looking for a job in a place like this? The logic was crushing, an inescapable truth that hit Gerardo with the force of a physical blow. He realized that if Valeria had walked in announcing her Formula One experience, he would have automatically dismissed her as a pathological liar or a fantasist. The irony was brutal. The only way he could believe her credentials was to see her demonstrate them in action, a lesson in humility that would be seared into his memory. Besides, Valeria continued, returning to the engine with renewed concentration, I've learned that in this industry, especially for women, credentials on paper don't matter as much as what you can prove with your hands. People always find ways to explain why a woman doesn't deserve to be where she is, no matter how qualified. Those words struck Gerardo like punches to the gut. He remembered dozens of comments he had made over the years about women in the auto industry, about how they naturally lacked the strength or the mechanical intuition of men. Every one of those comments now felt like evidence of his own profound ignorance, his deep-seated misogyny. What really happened at Red Bull? Don Evaristo asked gently, clearly sensing there was a deeper story behind Valeria's departure from the world of Formula One, a hidden wound that needed to be brought into the light. Valeria paused for a long time, her hands hovering over a specific part of the engine, as if gathering the strength to speak her truth. When she finally did, her voice had a different quality, as if she were telling a story she had tried to bury for months, releasing a weight from her soul. There was an incident during the 2020 season, she began slowly, a diagnostic error that cost us important points in the championship. The tension in the workshop thickened. Everyone understood the implications. In Formula One, where margins of victory are measured in tenths of a second and championships are decided by single points, a mechanical error could cost millions of dollars and ruin entire careers. It was a brutal truth that put the magnitude of her supposed mistake into perspective. Was it your fault? Someone from the crowd asked, their voice laced with nervous curiosity. No, Valeria replied firmly, her voice an echo of conviction. The subsequent investigation proved it was a manufacturing defect in a new part that had somehow passed every quality control check. A wave of relief washed over the workshop. But by the time the truth came out, she continued, I had already been singled out as the one responsible. Why you, specifically? Gerardo asked, though a sinister part of his mind already suspected the answer. Because I was the only woman on the lead technical team, Valeria stated, not with bitterness, but with the weary resignation of someone who had lived that reality time and again. When something went wrong and they needed someone to blame, it was easier to point at the person who already stood out. That's unfair, Don Evaristo murmured, his eyes flashing with empathy and indignation. That's the industry, Valeria corrected him. Not just in Formula One, but everywhere. When you're a woman in a male-dominated field, you have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. And when something goes wrong, you're the first suspect, regardless of the evidence. A wave of nausea washed over Gerardo. Valeria's description of systemic discrimination resonated painfully with his own attitudes. He recalled countless times he had automatically assumed women were less competent, attributed their successes to luck or male assistance, or made harmless comments he now recognized as deeply prejudiced. His ego was crumbling before the inescapable truth. And after Red Bull? Patricio asked, his voice now completely stripped of its earlier arrogance, holding only a thread of curiosity and a hint of shame. After Red Bull, I discovered that a reputation follows you everywhere, Valeria said, beginning to reconnect wires in the engine with an expert's fluid, precise movements. Even after my name was cleared, the story that circulated in the industry was different. Rumors spread faster than retractions. Did no one defend you? Emiliano asked, genuinely horrified. Some did, but quietly, Valeria admitted, her voice a resigned whisper. In a world where contracts are worth millions and professional relationships are everything, not many people are willing to risk their own careers to defend someone who's already been marked as problematic. The brutal honesty of that statement left everyone in silence. It was a window into a world most of them had never considered. A world of high-stakes politics where individual talent could be destroyed by power dynamics that had nothing to do with technical skill. How long have you been out of work? At your real level? Don Evaristo asked, his voice full of respect and compassion. 8 months, Valeria replied. 8 months of applying to smaller teams, to local workshops, to anywhere that would give me a chance to prove I could still do the work. And they all turned you down? Gerardo asked, though he already knew the answer, the bitter truth hitting him with full force. Most didn't even reply, Valeria confirmed. The ones who did usually said I was overqualified, or that my experience wouldn't be applicable to their simpler operations. Gerardo realized with a jolt that he had been on the verge of using those exact same excuses. If Valeria had mentioned her Formula One experience from the start, he would have dismissed her immediately as someone too complicated, too expensive for his shop. The irony was cruel. But the truth is, Valeria continued, making what appeared to be the final adjustments to the engine, her hands moving with the confidence of a master. Mechanics is mechanics. The fundamental principles are the same, whether it's a Formula One car or a street-legal Porsche. The only difference is the level of precision required and the consequences of an error. As she spoke, her hands moved with an assurance that everyone could now recognize as the mastery of someone who had worked at the highest possible levels of her profession. Every movement was economical, precise, a dance of skill that left them all speechless. What exactly did you find in the engine? Don Evaristo asked, clearly fascinated. Exactly what I suspected from the beginning, Valeria replied, beginning to close the hood. The solution to a complex problem was revealed with astonishing simplicity. This engine was modified for competition by someone who knew what they were doing, but the diagnostics were run using standard protocols. It's like trying to tune a Stradivarius with techniques meant for a student violin. The analogy was perfect. Everyone understood immediately. The problem hadn't been the engine, it had been the approach to diagnosing it. Are you finished? Gerardo asked, his voice thick with an anxiety he could no longer hide. Almost, Valeria said, walking to the driver's side door. Now comes the important part. She slid behind the wheel of the Porsche 911, her hands finding their position, as if she had driven high-performance cars thousands of times, which, they now realized, she likely had during track tests with Formula One teams. The thought completely reframed their perception of her. Are you sure it's going to work? Patricio asked, his voice a mixture of hope and terror, the workshop's future hanging in the balance. Valeria looked at him through the windshield and smiled. It wasn't a nervous or hopeful smile. It was the calm, confident smile of a professional who knew exactly what she had done and what the result would be. At Red Bull Racing, she said calmly, there's no room for uncertainty. You either know something is going to work or you don't. I know this is going to work. She placed her hand on the ignition key. The entire workshop held its breath. 20 pairs of eyes were fixed on the black Porsche, waiting for the moment that would determine not only Valeria's fate, but the humiliation or vindication of Gerardo Santander. Valeria turned the key. What happened next wiped the smirk off Gerardo's face forever and changed the lives of everyone present in ways none of them could have imagined. The engine didn't just start, it roared. The sound that filled the workshop wasn't just an engine turning over. It was a perfect mechanical symphony, a deep, powerful roar that echoed off the concrete walls like the cry of a beast awakening from a long slumber. The Porsche 911 hadn't just started. It had come roaring back to life with a power and harmony that no one there had ever heard before. The sound was clean, steady, perfect. There was none of the erratic sputtering that had plagued the engine for the past week. None of the irregular vibrations that had frustrated Patricio, Emiliano, and Rodrigo for days. This was the sound of 6 German cylinders working in perfect synchronization, like an orchestra conducted by a master. Gerardo was frozen, his mouth agape in an expression of absolute shock. For 20 years, he had run the most prestigious workshop in the city. He had heard thousands of engines start. He had developed an ear so trained he could diagnose problems by sound alone. But what he was hearing now was something else entirely. It was mechanical perfection made audible. His legs began to tremble as the full realization of what he had just witnessed hit him like an avalanche. Valeria Morales, the woman he had publicly humiliated, the woman he had treated as less than human, had just solved in 30 minutes what his best mechanics couldn't fix in a week. The 20 onlookers stood like statues, witnessing a modern miracle. The chasm between their expectations and this reality was so vast, their brains struggled to process it. They had come expecting to see a woman fail spectacularly. Instead, they were witnessing a display of technical mastery that surpassed anything they had ever seen. Gerardo's humiliation was silent but devastating, a punishment greater than any words, a truth searing itself into his soul. Don Evaristo was the first to react. With 65 years of experience, he had a profound respect for true competence. no matter where it came from. He approached the Porsche slowly, his eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and awe. "My God," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the engine's perfect hum. "In 40 years, I've never heard a Porsche sound this perfect." Valeria sat behind the wheel, her posture completely transformed. She was no longer the hunched, quiet woman who had walked in looking for a job. She was a world-class professional who had just proven exactly why she had reached the pinnacle of her industry. She gently pressed the accelerator, and the engine responded instantly, the roar intensifying but remaining perfectly smooth. It was like hearing the difference between an amateur singer and Pavarotti hitting the same note. "How?" Patricio finally found his voice, though it was strangled and weak. "How is that possible?" Valeria switched off the engine and stepped out of the car with fluid, professional grace. As she walked toward the petrified group, there was no submission left in her stride. There was only the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own value and had no reason to hide it anymore. "It's possible," she answered calmly, "when you understand that every engine has its own personality, especially one modified for competition. You were trying to speak to it in the wrong language." Her voice carried a new authority no one in the workshop had heard before. It wasn't arrogance. It was the unshakable confidence of someone who had just proven her competence beyond all doubt. "What did you do, exactly?" Emiliano asked, his voice filled with a humility that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. "I recalibrated the timing to competition specs instead of factory specs," Valeria explained, as if giving a master class. "I adjusted the fuel mixture to work with the internal modifications and corrected 3 diagnostic errors that had created secondary problems." Each technical term was a stab to the egos of the 3 mechanics. They were realizing that not only had they failed to solve the problem, their attempts had actually made it worse. "Diagnostic errors?" Rodrigo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "When you applied standard protocols to a modified engine, you created a chain reaction of misalignments," Valeria explained patiently. "Every correction you made based on the wrong diagnostics caused new problems. It's like trying to tune a piano after changing the strings without adjusting the tension." The analogy was devastatingly clear. They hadn't just failed, they had actively created more problems with every attempt. Gerardo felt his world collapsing. For 20 years, he had built his reputation on the belief that he ran the best technical team in the city. He had boasted to clients and competitors about his mechanics' superiority. He had used that supposed superiority to justify his premium prices and his arrogant attitude. And now he was faced with the brutal realization that a woman he had treated as inferior had proven to be infinitely more competent than anyone on his payroll, including himself. "Gerardo," Don Evaristo said, approaching his boss, his voice carrying a seriousness the older man rarely showed. "Do you realize what we just witnessed?" Gerardo couldn't answer. His throat was tight with a toxic mix of shame, terror, and the overwhelming realization that he had just made the costliest mistake of his professional career. "We just watched someone who worked with Max Verstappen solve in half an hour what we couldn't in a week," Don Evaristo continued, his voice rising in intensity, his gaze fixed on Gerardo. "And instead of recognizing her talent, we publicly humiliated her." The veteran mechanic's words cut through the air like knives. Everyone present knew they had witnessed not just an extraordinary technical display, but a massive injustice that had just been corrected in the most spectacular way possible. The crowd began to murmur, processing the implications. Some looked ashamed of their part in Valeria's initial humiliation. Others were simply fascinated to have seen world-class competence up close, but they all understood they had been part of something extraordinary. "So, what now?" someone asked from the back. The question was aimed at Gerardo, but he seemed unable to respond. His world of certainties had been so completely shattered he couldn't even form coherent words. Valeria walked toward him, and for the first time since she had entered the workshop, Gerardo truly saw her. She wasn't the desperate woman he had imagined. She was a world-class professional, forced by unjust circumstances to seek opportunities far beneath her. "Mr. Santander," Valeria said, her voice professional but firm, "I believe we have an agreement to discuss." The mention of the agreement struck Gerardo like a bolt of lightning. It was a promise born of pure arrogance. He had vowed to give her a full partnership in the workshop if she could fix the engine. He had made the promise with the absolute certainty that she would fail. But now, he faced the terrifying realization that he would have to make good on his word. His workshop, his reputation, his empire, painstakingly built over 2 decades, was all about to change forever because of an arrogant wager he'd made to humiliate a woman who had turned out to be infinitely more talented than him. The deal. Gerardo finally found his voice, though it sounded broken and thin. It was that if you fix the engine, I'd make you a partner. Valeria confirmed without emotion, simply stating the facts. And the engine isn't just fixed, it now runs better than it did when it first came in. It was the truth, and everyone knew it. The roar they had heard wasn't merely the sound of a running engine. It was the sound of an optimized machine working at its absolute peak. Gerardo glanced around the workshop, his eyes scanning the faces of his employees. He saw genuine respect directed at Valeria, but he also saw questions directed at him. He realized his authority, built for years on the belief in his own technical superiority, had just been fundamentally shattered. "And if I don't honor the deal?" he asked weakly, though he already knew the answer. "Then," Valeria replied calmly, "besides proving you have no professional honor, you will also have to explain to everyone here why your word is worthless." A tense silence filled the room. 20 witnesses had heard the original agreement. 20 people had watched Valeria fulfill her end of the bargain spectacularly. The social and professional pressure for Gerardo to keep his promise was overwhelming. But more than the pressure, Gerardo was facing a devastating personal truth. He had spent 20 years believing he was the best in his field, only to discover he had been operating on a fundamentally lower level than the woman he had just tried to shame. The question was no longer just whether he would keep his promise. The question was whether his ego could survive what he had just learned about himself. The silence in the workshop had grown so dense, it seemed to have a physical weight. Gerardo stood motionless, processing not only Valeria's words, but the full magnitude of what it meant to fulfill his promise. For 2 decades, he had built his entire identity around being the undisputed owner of the most prestigious workshop in the city. The thought of sharing that ownership, especially with someone he had so grotesquely underestimated, was like contemplating the death of everything he believed himself to be. His eyes moved slowly across the workshop, taking in every detail, as if for the first time. The state-of-the-art tools he'd bought to impress clients, the luxury cars that represented his status, the employees who had seen him as an unquestionable authority for years. All of it was about to change because of a single, arrogant decision. Gerardo, Don Evaristo approached his boss, placing a fatherly hand on his shoulder. I know what you're thinking. I know this isn't what you expected when you made that bet. Gerardo looked at the veteran mechanic, the only employee who had been with him since the very beginning. In Don Evaristo's eyes, he saw decades of loyalty, but also something new, profound disappointment. But you have to understand something, Don Evaristo continued, his voice low but firm. What we just witnessed wasn't just a mechanical repair. It was a lesson in humility that all of us needed to learn. A lesson? Gerardo finally found his voice, though it was cracked. A lesson that's going to cost me my business. A lesson that could save it, Don Evaristo corrected gently. Gerardo, in all my years working here, I have never seen a display of technical competence like the one we just witnessed. If you have someone at Valeria's level as a partner, this workshop could become something you haven't even imagined. The old man's words resonated in Gerardo's mind, but they crashed against decades of ego and absolute control. The idea of sharing authority, especially with someone who had proven to be his technical superior, was terrifying on a visceral level. Besides, a voice added from the crowd, we all heard the deal. We all saw her hold up her end. Gerardo turned to the employee who had spoken, a young mechanic named Carlos. On his face, Gerardo saw something he had never seen before, an open questioning of his authority. What are you implying, Carlos? Gerardo asked, his voice taking on a defensive edge. I'm not implying anything, Carlos replied, with a bravery that surprised everyone, including himself. I'm saying it directly. If you don't keep your word after what we just saw, it's going to be very hard to respect you as our boss. The words struck Gerardo like a physical blow. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his employees' respect was guaranteed by his position. Now, he realized that respect had been based on a perception of competence that had just been brutally dismantled. Carlos is right, another employee chimed in. We all saw what happened here. If your word means nothing when you lose a bet, how can we trust your promises about raises, promotions, or anything else? Gerardo felt the floor moving beneath his feet. His employees, who had been submissively obedient for years, were now openly confronting him. The authority he had taken for granted for decades was evaporating before his very eyes. Patrizio, Emiliano, and Rodrigo remained silent, but their expressions spoke volumes. The shame of being so completely outmatched by someone they had dismissed was plain on their faces. But more than shame, there was a new understanding. They had all been operating on a technical level far below what they had believed for years.